All right. So we were talking about
Where are we?
Antietam
Okay.
and how that was the moment when the Union
Preliminary
realized
proclamation.
proclamation, where it's like, okay, slavery has to be a thing as a central part
Yep.
of the Civil War. And so where does that take us? Also, very bloody battle. The generals, McClellan, is the end of the McClellan chapter. And that takes us to Fredericksburg. So what happened in Fredericksburg?
Fredericksburg was it's another victory for Lee. It's an easy victory for Lee. He has a very strong position on high ground across the Rappahannock River from the Union forces who are opposite Fredericksburg. His opponent is a guy named Ambrose Everett Burnside, who's a very affable guy, kind of a nice guy, who gave us the word sideburns. He wore his whiskers. They came down and came up and made, and
Nice.
it wasn't a beard, and they were called Burnsides at the time, the Burnside cut, which was transposed into sideburns. Everybody liked him. He just wasn't very bright in some ways. He's a politician after the war, so he went into the right field. But his idea at Fredericksburg was to, in the end, it wasn't his original plan, but he ended up launching frontal assaults, one brigade at a time, against very strongly entrenched Confederates. And it was a butchery and another horrible defeat for the Army of the Potomac. Lincoln was really cast down by it. And it just seemed that in this Eastern theater, he could not get any good news. He's getting good news from the West. He's not getting any good news here. And he has this revolving door of commanders. Burnside tried another march in late January 1863. He was going to get around Lee's flank, but he had horrible weather. His army literally got stuck in the mud. It was lampooned as the Mud March, and he removed him from command. So now he has another commander in the Army of the Potomac. So you've had McClellan and Burnside, and now a guy named Joseph Hooker. You have no continuity at the top in that army. You have complete continuity at the top in the Army of Northern Virginia, which is a huge advantage to the Army of Northern Virginia.
So this is where the famous words of Robert E. Lee, where he was watching the slaughter,
Yes.
He said that it is well that war is so terrible, or we should grow too fond of it.
Yep.
What did he mean by that?
He was watching his soldiers butcher Union soldiers, and I guess kind of enjoying it. He's in a really strong position with really good artillery supporting his infantry, and the Union troops are just attacking them and not having any success. And so there he is. He's up there with James Longstreet and other people and watching it. And he, unlike McClellan, was willing to risk, obviously, piling up casualties in every battle. Didn't have that many at Fredericksburg. There were about 12,500 U.S. casualties at Fredericksburg and about 5,500 Confederate casualties because they were so well protected in their defensive lines.
So you are working on a manuscript on Chancellorsville.
Yes.
It's a legendary battle for many reasons.
It is.
Can you break down some of the military details of what made up that battle to give us a sense of, in general, what battles were like?
This is often described as Lee's most successful battle. It's him against Joseph Hooker. It's the last battle that Lee and Jackson fought as a team. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, with Stonewall Jackson as his principal subordinate. Hooker had replaced Burnside. Hooker had maneuvered to get rid of Burnside. He wanted to be in commander of the army. He had made a statement that he said what the nation needed was a dictator to make sure it won. And Lincoln, one of the best letters a president ever wrote to a military commander, Lincoln wrote to Hooker, and he said, basically, I know everything you're saying. You're talking about all the things you're going to do. And he said that the only way you get to be a dictator is if you have victories, and I'm willing to risk a dictatorship to get victories. And so I know I've got you figured out, Joe, he's saying, and he did. Hooker made a lot of blustery talk. He had a great start. He built the army into what he called the greatest army on the planet, about 135,000 men, beautifully supplied, reorganized the medical service in it. He did everything that you should do to get an army in shape. And then he started a campaign. His plan, Lee was still at Fredericksburg. He was going to get around Lee's left flank, come in behind him, force Lee to either retreat to Richmond or fight him on unfavorable ground. Everything went well with Hooker. He got going in late April until the moment of truth came. The moment of truth came on May 1st, 1863, when Lee, instead of retreating, left part of his army to watch one part of Hooker's and turned around to meet Hooker head on near a crossroads called Chancellorsville, a few miles west of Fredericksburg. And as soon as the fighting started, McClellan lost his nerve, pulled into a defensive position, and the upshot was, after Lee and Jackson carried off a very successful flank attack, although it left Hooker still in a very strong position, Hooker in the end retreated. And it was another victory for Lee in a battle he never, ever should have won. He was outnumbered 2-1, 135,000 to about 64,000. And when the moment of truth came, Joseph Hooker just lost his nerve. I mean, I really do believe that. I had fun working on this book. I wrote a lot of books on campaigns are very long and detailed. I wanted a short book that would introduce interested readers who didn't really know that much, perhaps, to there's one of the maps.
So there's different positions, the different troops positions. There's Hooker.
Yes, that is the battle played out on May 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. There's the opening of the campaign. See the Rappahannock River, Fredericksburg. The armies are facing each other there. Hooker's plan was to leave part of his army to hold Lee's attention and move the rest up the river, up the Rappahannock, cross the Rappahannock and then the Rapidan and get behind Lee so that Lee would be caught in a vice. He'd have Hooker in his rear and the anvil of other Union troops at Fredericksburg, and he thought that that would force Lee to retreat toward Richmond and that he could then harass him. They get around, they get behind Lee, they do exactly what Hooker wanted to do. He got to Chancellorsville. He had more than 70,000 men at Chancellorsville, and Lee doesn't find out till the very end of April what's going on, and then he decides to divide his army, leave 10,000 men to watch 40,000 Federals at Fredericksburg, and he and Stonewall Jackson head back toward Chancellorsville to meet Hooker, and they meet on May the 1st. The fighting starts on May the 1st. Everybody's upbeat in the Army of the Potomac. They've gotten around Lee's flank. They know they're behind him. Everything seems to go very well. Hooker said, "This is it. We've done it. We've done exactly what I wanted to do." And then the fighting starts the next day on May 1st. They march toward that place called Zoan Church. You can see there, it's just a little bit east of Chancellorsville. And the fighting, they collide about 11 in the morning. 2 o'clock that afternoon, Hooker orders a retreat. Everybody retreats back into this wilderness. It's a kind of cut-over, woodsy area that has very few roads, and he just hunkers down around Chancellorsville, hands the initiative to Lee. The next day, Jackson and Lee decide to send Jackson all the way around the right flank, and you see the flank march there. They strike a Union corps that's exposed, commanded by a man named Oliver Otis Howard. Howard University is named after him. He headed the Freedmen's Bureau later in the war. They crush the 11th Corps, which has a very high German element in it, and there's a lot of ethnic prejudice that comes into play there by the other soldiers. But the day ends up with Lee actually in worse shape than he was before. He's got 2 divisions over here under Anderson and McLaws on the lower right. He's not even in touch with Jackson's corps. Jackson was wounded that night by his own men, carried from the field. He'd die a few days later. And Hooker still, although Hooker is in between these 2 parts of Lee's army, he's in an ideal position. He's still just thinking about the defensive. And we're on the morning of May 3rd. The 2 parts of Lee's army fight their way together around the Chancellorsville clearing, and Hooker then retreats toward the north. You have this amazing moment on May the 3rd where Hooker, who's been stunned by an artillery round that hit a pillar he was leaning against at Chancellorsville, he had a concussion, he was vomiting. He retreated to the rear, and as the Union troops retreated from that clearing near Chancellorsville, Lee's army had fought itself together, and Lee rode into the middle of his troops. And there was this amazing moment when this spontaneous outpouring of emotion on the part of the Confederates. That's the moment when Lee and his men finished this period of bonding this year that was unmatched in the Civil War. See, there's no way Lee should have won this battle. There's one more day of action a little farther to the east, but in the end, Hooker retreats. He never should have retreated. He was in an impregnable position, but he did retreat. And Lincoln was absolutely beside himself after this. He just couldn't. Everybody knew what the numbers were. The newspapers had talked about it, that Lee had only half as many men as Hooker. And once again, the Army of the Potomac, the largest and most important army of the Republic, has been defeated by this smaller army. Lee's sort of legend in the North grew, and in the South. He became, by this point, he and his army were the most important national institution in the Confederacy. People looked to them to see whether independence, like Washington and the Continental Army during the Revolution. If they're still in the field, there's still a chance for victory. This cemented that position for Lee, this victory at Chancellorsville did, in the minds of Confederates, and made him a kind of bugaboo to people in the North. They were just thirsty for someone to defeat Lee and capture Richmond.
So this, in some sense, created the legend of Robert E. Lee.
It certainly helped solidify. Yes, it did. It went a long way toward doing it. Long way.
You write about, the difference between sort of reality and memory. How does the North remember this battle, and how does the South remember this battle?
It's really fascinating. The North remembers this battle by not remembering it very much. They sort of airbrush it out of their memory of the war. The Confederates, in the iconography of the lost cause, Lee and Jackson had their last meeting ever here just before the fighting on May 2nd got going. And there was a famous painting of that done by an artist named Giulio that was then reprinted as a lithograph that hung in innumerable homes and offices and courthouses in the South. It's Lee and Jackson at high tide, kind of. Gettysburg hasn't happened, never mind Appomattox. These are the two greatest Confederate soldiers at their greatest moment of success. It became hugely important in the lost cause telling of the war. On the Union side, they didn't want to talk about Joseph Hooker that much. They'd rather talk about other things.
Yeah, it's probably one of the most humiliating battles of the war.
I think it's amazing that Hooker lost this. It's just amazing. It shows the complete dominance of one personality over another personality, in my view.
So Stonewall Jackson was shot
by his own men out trying to reconnoiter and keep the battle going and exploit his successes, carried back to the rear, and he died. He died on May 10th, died 8 days later.
So what impact did that have of Stonewall Jackson's death?
Well, there was unbelievable mourning across the Confederacy about that. And even it's really interesting, even some positive comments in the North about how he'd been he's misguided, but a very religious guy and all of this stuff. But they're quietly that's really good news for the United States that Stonewall Jackson is dead, and really bad news for the Confederacy.
Outside the myth, did it actually have a practical impact on the war?
I don't think so. And the people who love Stonewall Jackson would disagree with me, but I don't see where he would have. He was a very good soldier at what he did, and Lee used him very well, and they were a good partnership. But I don't see how he would have changed the larger contours of the war. I don't.
If we zoom out and look at Robert E. Lee, somebody you've written about quite a bit, studied a lot, do you think we can use this battle to try to understand the military genius of the man and, in general, who he was?
I do, and it shows both why he was successful and why some of the reasons he was successful opened the way for what should have been big defeats but didn't. I mean, Lee's personality was at heart aggressive. His first impulse was always to take the war to the opponent. He said, they outnumber us. If we just sit and wait for them to come to us, they're going to have all the advantages. We need to try to disrupt them and look for openings. What this campaign showed was his audacity. He divided his army 3 times in the course of this campaign in the face of a much more powerful opponent, which showed his audacity. It also highlighted the overall culture that he created in his army, which was a culture of risk-taking, of seeking to inflict the greatest possible harm on your opponent. It's the antithesis of the culture that McClellan created in the Army of the Potomac, which is a culture of caution, of not taking risks, of not doing anything until everything is just right.
Mm-hmm.
Any adult knows everything is never just right. So if you're waiting for that, you'll never do anything. It's the two cultures are absolutely antithetical to one another. And in the end, it shows Lee and how what he had accomplished. He had created an army that was willing to absorb casualties because it won all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And they realized that was, they believed, making it more likely that their whole war effort would be successful. There are only a few times during the war where you get a scene like you got on May 3rd, where this whole army sees the old man ride into their midst, basically, and just has this. I think they decided at that point, the soldiers, that he was always going to win. And Lee looked at them and thought, they can do whatever I ask them to do. I think if you want to understand Gettysburg, if you want to understand Pickett's charge, you need to look back to May 3rd at Chancellorsville, when Lee just decided that his infantry could do anything he wanted them to do.
But also from the infantry perspective, they believed in the...
You asked me earlier about what did the soldiers' letters say. The letters from Lee's army, they absolutely didn't even contemplate losing to the Army of the Potomac. I mean, they just didn't think they would lose to it.
What do you attribute that to? Does it Robert E. Lee to him?
It's to Lee and the fact that they won these victories under Lee and that they took these chances, and everybody and they always knew that they were outnumbered, and yet they were still winning. The closest the numbers had ever been at the 7 days, when the armies were about the same size. But after that, Lee is always at a significant disadvantage in numbers, and yet he seems to be victorious.
So Lee's aggressiveness, like you've mentioned, produced also staggering casualties.
Staggering casualties. He lost 13,000 men here, and Hooker about 17,500, a much higher proportion of Lee's army than Hooker lost in his army. But this should have been a disaster for Lee.
Yeah.
Hooker should have crushed Lee here. Absolutely should have crushed Lee, but he didn't.
So there's two cases. Lee's audacity being the South's best hope of winning the war, but the other case is he was actually bleeding the South dry.
Yes, and historians have criticized him for not just being on the defensive all the time. I think Lee understood, better than many of his critics now understand, that the key was Northern civilian opinion. Mm-hmm. He said it more than once. If we win victories, it will depress their morale. If their morale is depressed, the Democrats will do better. If the Democrats get into office, it's good for the Confederacy. And he also knew that it's a race between, am I going to run out of men before they run out of morale in the United States? I think he understood that. And I think that was the best chance for the Confederacy to win. And in the end, I'm very happy to report, the Confederacy ran out of men before the Union ran out of morale. And so the war went the way it did. But I think Lee was very perceptive in that regard. He understood how important politically what happened militarily was. Much better understanding of that than a lot of people had at the time, and better understanding, I think, than a lot of historians have now. And this is a horrible time for the U.S. because behind the lines, people are Democrats are unhappy with the Emancipation Proclamation. Just 2 months before this, Congress passed the Conscription Act. Democrats are very unhappy about that. They're saying that Lincoln is a tyrant. He's forcing people into a war that's not the war they wanted to fight anyway. Union morale is very fragile. Civilian morale at this point, and this makes it much, much worse. The draft riots in New York City, the first draft numbers were pulled in New York City in July. The draft riots come right after Gettysburg, but that is symptomatic of what morale. Desertions went up in the Army of the Potomac after the Emancipation Proclamation.
So at this point, the Confederacy is arguably very close to winning the war.
I think this is one of the more optimistic points for the Confederacies in the late spring and early summer of 1863. Yes, I do.
If Robert E. Lee is correct and that it's all about morale, which seems like a valid argument, then this feels like very close to breaking the morale of the Union.
In the Eastern Theater, I think it is. But in the Western Theater, we have our boy Grant, who's operating against Vicksburg at this point. So there are two big campaigns kind of going on at this time, and Vicksburg is the other one.